It was another quiet evening in our house, the kind of evening where every sound felt amplified in the silence, where even the tick of the clock seemed louder, as if it were reminding me of time slipping by. I had grown used to nights like this, evenings where my husband, Ethan, was away on business, and the house felt too big, too empty. The stillness had become routine, just like the rest of my life, predictable, orderly, almost scripted. I had thought marriage would be different, that it would be filled with a warmth that would make moments like these feel cozy rather than isolating. Ethan and I had once shared that closeness, or at least I thought we did in the early years when everything seemed new and exciting. But as time went on, he grew busier, more absorbed in his work, and our conversations became more about logistics than dreams. Somewhere along the way, the spark had faded, replaced by a comfortable but hollow rhythm. I moved around the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of wine, trying to savor the quiet. It was strange how I both craved and dreaded these moments alone. They were a chance to breathe, yet they reminded me just how much I had lost over the years, a connection, a feeling of being truly seen. It was easier to blame it on life, to think that maybe this was just how marriage went. But there were nights, like tonight, when I felt the void, like an ache that had been waiting for me all day. Just as I was lost in thought, I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. I tensed for a second, out of habit, before I remembered that Ethan wasn't home. It was my stepson, Ryan, who had moved back in a few weeks ago, after spending a year away at college. He had hit a rough patch, something about grades slipping, struggling with the adjustment, and Ethan suggested he stay with us to get back on track. Ryan entered the kitchen, his steps quiet but confident, carrying an energy that felt almost out of place in our otherwise subdued home. He had grown so much in the past year, shedding the last traces of boyhood for something sharper, more self-assured. There was a quiet intensity about him that I hadn't noticed before, a look in his eyes that spoke of experiences I couldn't quite place. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, glancing at him over the rim of my glass. He smiled, a little shy but relaxed, and shook his head. "No, just restless, I guess. It's hard to get back into a routine here. Everything feels different." I nodded, trying to imagine what it must be like for him. To leave only to come back and find everything the same, yet somehow changed. We hadn't been close, not really. He was already a teenager when I married Ethan, and our interactions had always been polite, cordial. Yet there was an unspoken distance that lingered, a line neither of us seemed willing to cross. But tonight, standing in the dim light of the kitchen, I sensed something different in him, a willingness to let down his guard. "Want some tea?" I offered, gesturing to the kettle on the stove. It felt odd reaching out like this, as if I were stepping into a new role, one that wasn't quite motherly but not entirely detached. "Sure," he replied, settling into one of the chairs at the kitchen table. I filled the kettle and set it to boil, feeling a strange urge to keep the conversation going. "How's school treating you? I know you've had a lot on your plate." The question came out gentle, probing, but I wanted him to know I was genuinely curious, that he could talk to me if he needed to. Ryan hesitated, then shrugged, his gaze drifting somewhere over my shoulder. "It's been okay, I guess. Just didn't go the way I thought it would. I thought college would be, different. But it was just more of the same." He paused, a shadow flickering across his face. "I think I expected more, but maybe that was just me." I nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. I knew that feeling all too well, the gap between expectation and reality, the realization that what we think will fulfill us often falls short. For a moment, it felt as though he were speaking directly to something in me, an unvoiced longing that I hadn't allowed myself to fully recognize. "It's hard to find what you're looking for sometimes," I said softly, more to myself than to him. But he caught it, his eyes meeting mine with a sharpness that surprised me. The kettle whistled, breaking the tension that had crept between us. I busied myself pouring the tea, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. It was just a simple conversation, I reminded myself, nothing more. Yet there was a spark in the air, something unspoken that lingered even as we sipped our tea in silence. "So, do you ever get lonely here?" Ryan's question caught me off guard, his voice gentle yet probing, as if he sensed there was more beneath the surface. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to answer. I could feel the honesty creeping in, tugging at me, but it felt risky, vulnerable. I didn't want him to see that part of me, not so openly. Yet, under the quiet of the night, it felt almost safe to admit it. "Sometimes," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I think everyone feels that way at some point." He nodded, his gaze softening, and I realized how much I had let my guard down, letting him see the cracks I usually kept hidden. It was strange, this unexpected openness between us, as if we had stumbled upon a shared understanding that neither of us fully understood. We sat in comfortable silence, sipping our tea, letting the quiet settle over us like a blanket. And in that silence, I felt something shift, something I couldn't quite name, but that left me feeling lighter, as if a part of me had been waiting for this moment all along. As he stood to leave, he gave me a small smile, one that felt intimate, as though we had shared something just for us. "Good night," he said softly, his voice warm and gentle. "Good night, Ryan," I replied, my own voice softer than I intended. He left the kitchen, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the strange, lingering warmth in the pit of my stomach. I stood there for a moment, staring into my half-empty glass, trying to shake off the feeling that something had changed, that the silence of our home was no longer the same. It was unsettling, yet I couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity, a quiet thrill that pulsed beneath my calm exterior. The following night unfolded in much the same way. Ethan was away again, which had become routine over the years. Our house felt as it always did, quiet, subdued, and somehow heavier in his absence. I was accustomed to the solitude, to the echoes of my own thoughts filling the empty rooms. But tonight, there was something different, a feeling I couldn't shake since my unexpected exchange with Ryan the night before. I found myself looking at the clock more often, feeling the seconds stretch as I lingered in the living room, hoping for something I couldn't quite define. It felt odd, almost foolish, waiting up like this. But I reminded myself that it wasn't intentional, I was just restless. That was all. Oh. Eventually, I moved to the kitchen, deciding to make myself some tea again, hoping it might help calm the unease that had settled in my chest. I turned on the soft kitchen light and set the kettle to boil. The quiet of the house pressed in around me, and I wondered if Ryan was awake. The thought surprised me, catching me off guard. As if on cue, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, almost expecting it this time, but still feeling a quick jolt of surprise as Ryan appeared in the doorway. He looked relaxed, his hands shoved into the pockets of his sweatshirt, his hair slightly messy from sleep. There was an easy smile on his face, one that somehow made the room feel warmer. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice more casual than I felt. He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Seems like a theme around here," he replied, his tone playful. I let out a small laugh, more out of habit than amusement, but there was a strange comfort in his presence. He had this way of filling the space, of making the silence feel less oppressive. "I was just making some tea," I said, gesturing toward the kettle. "Would you like some?" He nodded, and I turned back to finish the task, feeling his gaze linger on me. There was something in the air between us, an energy that felt both familiar and foreign. I couldn't place it, but I didn't want it to end. As I poured the tea, he moved closer, reaching around me to grab a mug from the cabinet. For a brief moment, his arm brushed against mine, a simple, innocent touch, but it sent a small shiver down my spine. I felt the warmth of his presence beside me, the closeness making me acutely aware of the space we shared. We sat down at the table, our cups steaming in front of us. The silence stretched, but it was a comfortable silence, one that felt like it had been there all along, waiting for us to settle into it. I looked at him, noticing the faint lines of tiredness around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed a little tense, as though he were carrying a weight he couldn't shake. "Is everything okay?" I asked softly, surprising myself with the question. I wasn't used to prying, especially not with Ryan, but something about the quiet vulnerability in his expression made me want to reach out. He glanced down at his mug, his fingers tracing the rim in a slow, thoughtful motion. Yeah, I guess. Just a lot on my mind lately. I nodded, giving him space to speak if he wanted to, but not pushing. I had learned that with Ryan, sometimes silence was the best way to let him open up. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine, as though trying to decide how much to reveal. It's just I don't know. Sometimes it feels like I don't really fit anywhere, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Like everyone around me seems to know exactly what they're doing, where they're going, and I'm just stuck. His words struck a chord, resonating in a way I hadn't expected. I knew that feeling all too well, the sense of being adrift, lost in a life that seemed to move forward without you. I wanted to offer him comfort, to tell him it would get better, but I wasn't sure if I believed that myself. It's okay to feel that way, I said gently. Sometimes finding your way takes time, and it's not always a straight path. He looked at me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You sound like you know a thing or two about that. I smiled back, a little ruefully. I guess I do. Life doesn't always turn out the way we think it will, but that doesn't mean it can't still be good. For a moment we just looked at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between us. It felt strange, this closeness, this shared vulnerability. I hadn't realized how much I had needed someone to talk to, someone who could see past the surface and understand the cracks beneath. He reached across the table, his hand resting on mine, a gesture so simple yet filled with meaning. The warmth of his touch spread through me, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I looked down at our hands, feeling a mix of emotions that I couldn't quite name. Thank you, he said softly, his voice carrying a sincerity that touched something deep within me. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. It was just a simple moment, but it felt significant, as though we had crossed some invisible line that neither of us could deny. I pulled my hand away, a soft smile on my lips, trying to keep things light despite the weight of the moment. We should probably get some sleep, I said, my voice a little too cheerful, or we'll both be zombies tomorrow. He chuckled, standing up and taking his mug to the sink. Yeah, you're probably right. Thanks for the tea and the talk. Anytime, I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. As he left the kitchen, I was left with the lingering warmth of his presence, the echo of his words resonating in the quiet. There was a strange ache in my chest, a longing that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. It felt dangerous, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. I washed the mugs, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite hold on to. This was just a simple connection, I told myself, a harmless moment of understanding. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I could feel it in the way my heart beat a little faster, in the way I found myself replaying our conversation in my mind, over and over. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, a shift in the way I saw him, in the way I felt when he was near. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his eyes. I knew I was treading dangerous ground, that these feelings, whatever they were, could lead to something I wasn't ready to confront, but the allure of it, the forbidden thrill, was intoxicating. As I finally drifted off to sleep, a faint smile played on my lips. I told myself it was just a moment, a fleeting connection, but deep down I knew better. This was the beginning of something I couldn't quite name but couldn't deny. And as much as I wanted to resist, a part of me was already lost, drawn to the possibilities that lay hidden in the quiet, in the spaces between us. The days that followed took on a different rhythm, a new energy I hadn't anticipated. The house felt less empty, less lonely, as if some unseen tension had been awakened and lingered, shifting the atmosphere in subtle but undeniable ways. It was as though every quiet exchange, every small moment between Ryan and me, was woven with an undercurrent neither of us dared to acknowledge out loud. I knew this feeling should worry me, yet instead it filled me with a kind of thrill I hadn't felt in years. Ethan's absence became more frequent as he was called away on business, and the gaps he left behind were barely noticeable. If anything, I found myself strangely relieved by the solitude. There was a freedom to these evenings with Ryan that I hadn't felt in my marriage for years, a sense of companionship I didn't want to examine too closely. One Friday evening, after another long week of work and Ethan away again, I found myself drawn to the living room after dinner. Ryan was sitting on the couch, casually flipping through channels, and I joined him without thinking, settling onto the opposite end. It was natural, almost as if this was what our family routine had always been, just the two of us sharing the space. He glanced over, giving me a small, easy smile, and that simple gesture made my heart race. "Anything good on?" I asked, my tone light, trying to mask the tension building inside me. He shrugged. "Not really, just flipping around. You're welcome to choose." I picked up the remote, trying to steady my hands, and settled on an old movie that was one of my favorites, something I hadn't watched in years. As the familiar opening scenes began, a comfortable silence settled over us, though my senses were heightened to every small movement, every accidental brush of his arm against mine. "Have you seen this before?" I asked after a while, more for something to say than a real question. He shook his head. "No, but I'm open to new experiences." The way he said it, with a small, teasing smile, sent a thrill down my spine. There was a glint of something in his eyes, something that felt like a challenge, and I felt my pulse quicken in response. We sat there, the room dimly lit by the glow of the television, as the story unfolded on screen. I could feel his presence beside me, his warmth, the subtle scent of his cologne drifting over, and it was enough to leave me on edge. Every accidental touch, every shift in the cushions, seemed to send sparks through the room, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something. The movie progressed, and at one particularly emotional scene, I felt tears prickling my eyes. I tried to blink them away, embarrassed to be so affected, but Ryan noticed. He leaned closer, his expression softening. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, concerned. I nodded, feeling foolish. "It's silly, really. I always get emotional at this part." He smiled, his eyes warm and understanding. "It's not silly. It's kind of nice to care that much." There was a softness in his gaze, a quiet understanding that felt more intimate than words. I could feel the warmth of his hand as it moved to rest gently on my shoulder, a comforting gesture that felt anything but casual. My heart pounded, and I held still, feeling the tension between us grow with each passing second. We both turned back to the screen, but neither of us was watching anymore. His hand lingered on my shoulder, his thumb lightly grazing my collarbone in a way that felt intentional, sending a rush of heat through me. I wanted to pull away, to create some space, but I was rooted there, unable to move, caught in the pull of something I couldn't explain. The movie ended, but neither of us made a move to stand. The silence stretched, thick and charged, and I felt his gaze on me, waiting, as if he too was caught in this invisible pull. I began, trailing off as I gestured vaguely toward the kitchen, trying to break the spell that seemed to have settled over us. Ryan nodded, his expression unreadable, but he didn't move his hand. He held my gaze, his eyes searching mine, as though he was waiting for me to say something, to do something. The air between us felt heavy, filled with words left unspoken, emotions we both struggled to keep hidden. But before I could say anything more, he leaned closer, just enough for me to feel his breath, warm against my cheek, as he whispered, "You don't have to go." His words were soft, barely more than a murmur, but they resonated, sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't look away from him, couldn't break the connection that seemed to have taken on a life of its own. I opened my mouth, searching for something to say, something to bring us back to safer ground, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt myself leaning into him, drawn by a force I couldn't resist, couldn't deny. My hand reached for his, my fingers brushing against his, and he didn't pull away. We sat like that, caught in the silence, in the weight of everything we weren't saying. His hand moved, slowly, his fingers threading through mine, a simple gesture that felt electrifying. I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to process the emotions swirling inside me. And then, just as slowly, he leaned back, giving my hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it, as if sensing the unspoken boundaries we were both struggling to hold on to. "Good night," he said softly, his gaze lingering on mine, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite read. "Good night, Ryan," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I watched him walk down the hallway, his silhouette fading into the shadows, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The night air felt charged, as if it held the memory of that quiet, stolen moment, the touch of his hand still warm against mine. As I finally turned off the television and headed upstairs, I knew that things between us had shifted irrevocably. There was no denying the pull, the attraction that had taken root, growing quietly in the spaces between us, in the silences that spoke louder than words. I lay awake in bed, my mind racing, replaying every glance, every touch, every quiet word we had shared. It was wrong. I knew that, yet I couldn't deny the thrill, the exhilaration of it, the way it made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. The boundary we had crossed tonight felt fragile, tentative, yet powerful, as if it held the potential to unravel everything I had built, everything I thought I understood about myself. And as much as I tried to push the thoughts away, to fall asleep, and wake up to a sense of normalcy, I knew that things could never go back to the way they were. The morning light would bring its own clarity, perhaps a sense of regret or guilt. But for now, in the quiet of the night, all I could feel was the ache of possibility, the allure of something forbidden and thrilling that I couldn't bring myself to resist. I knew I was standing on dangerous ground, that the path I was treading could lead to heartbreak, to consequences I couldn't foresee. But in that moment, with the memory of his touch lingering, I felt the pull of something stronger than reason, stronger than fear. And as I lay there, caught in the silence, I realized that part of me didn't want to resist, that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment I had been waiting for, a chance to feel, to be seen, to be alive in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in a long, long time. The next day felt like a blur, the kind of day where you're present in body but not in mind, going through motions while your thoughts drift elsewhere. Every time I tried to focus, my mind would wander back to the previous night with Ryan, the subtle brush of his hand, the warmth of his touch, and the charged look in his eyes, all of it replayed in my head, refusing to let me move on. In a way, I was relieved that Ethan wasn't home. I didn't have to face him with these unsteady feelings that lingered beneath the surface, feelings I didn't fully understand yet. But part of me also knew that his absence was a double-edged sword, creating the very space where these feelings had room to grow. That evening, I tried to distract myself by keeping busy around the house. I cleaned, rearranged the bookshelves, even attempted a new recipe for dinner, but the anticipation of seeing Ryan again simmered just beneath the surface. Finally, unable to sit still any longer, I retreated to the living room with a book, hoping it would ground me, bring me back to a sense of normalcy. But of course, it wasn't long before I heard his footsteps behind me. I glanced up to see him hovering in the doorway, looking a little hesitant, as though he, too, felt the weight of what had transpired between us. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice casual, though his eyes held something deeper, something searching. I nodded, trying to keep my tone light. Of course, I could use the company. He settled onto the couch beside me, closer than necessary, but neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge it. The silence stretched between us, thick with an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to break. I glanced down at my book, pretending to read, though the words blurred on the page. "What are you reading?" he asked, after a moment, leaning over to catch a glimpse of the title. His arm brushed against mine, a fleeting touch, but it was enough to send a spark through me. "Oh, just an old favorite," I replied, feeling my cheeks grow warm. "Something I've read a dozen times, but it's comforting, you know." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a little too long. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes familiarity is nice." There was a softness in his voice, a warmth that made me feel exposed, as though he could see past the surface, past the walls I had carefully built. I looked away, focusing on a spot on the floor, trying to steady my breath. We sat in silence for a few moments, the space between us charged, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I could feel his presence beside me, the warmth radiating from him, drawing me in despite myself. "So, what do you think we should do for dinner?" he asked, breaking the silence, though his tone was soft, almost tentative. I shrugged, grateful for the small talk, for something to anchor us in reality. I was thinking of trying a new pasta recipe, something simple, but with a little twist. "Sounds good," he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Need any help?" I hesitated for a moment, torn between the practical answer and the part of me that wanted to spend more time with him, to feel his presence, to savor the warmth he brought into the room. "Sure," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. We moved to the kitchen, and the next hour unfolded in a way that felt oddly intimate, as if we were stepping into a routine that had always been ours. I handed him ingredients, showed him how to chop vegetables, and we laughed over silly mistakes, the tension between us softening into something warm and familiar. At one point, as he reached over to grab a spoon, his hand brushed against mine, lingering just a second too long. I looked up, our eyes meeting, and I felt a rush of warmth flood through me, the air thickening with an unspoken understanding. The sounds of the simmering pot and clinking dishes faded, leaving just the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt like it could go anywhere. But before I could process it, he pulled his hand away, a flicker of something regret, hesitation, desire crossing his face. "Sorry," he murmured, looking down, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, smiling softly, hoping to ease the tension. "It's okay. I'm just not used to having someone around to help, that's all." He nodded, his expression softening, and for a moment it felt as though we had found some kind of unspoken understanding, a quiet agreement to ignore the tension, to just exist in the moment, even if only for a little while. After dinner, we moved back to the living room, still caught in that strange, unsteady rhythm we had fallen into, each of us aware of the other in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I tried to keep my focus on the conversation, on the casual banter that had become our unspoken refuge, but my thoughts kept drifting, my heart racing every time our gazes met. "Can I ask you something?" he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Of course." He hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Do you ever wonder, I don't know, what your life would be like if things had turned out differently?" His question caught me off guard, stirring up thoughts and emotions I had long buried, dreams and regrets I had convinced myself were better left forgotten. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his question settle over me. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think everyone wonders about that, don't they? What their life might have been if they'd made different choices, taken different paths." He nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at me. "Yeah, I guess it's just comforting to know that, well, you're not alone in feeling that way." The way he looked at me in that moment, with such openness, such vulnerability, made my heart ache in a way I couldn't explain. It was as though he were reaching out, searching for something he had been missing, and I felt myself drawn to that, wanting to be whatever he needed, whatever I had been missing myself. Without thinking, I reached over, my hand resting on his arm. A small gesture, but one that felt intimate, charged with all the emotions we had been holding back. "Ryan," I began, my voice trailing off as I realized I didn't know what I wanted to say, didn't know how to put words to the feelings swirling inside me. He looked at me, his expression softening, his gaze intense, and for a moment it felt as though the whole world had faded away, leaving just the two of us, caught in a moment that felt fragile, suspended between possibility and reality. Slowly, almost instinctively, his hand moved to cover mine, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. His touch was warm, grounding, yet filled with a kind of tenderness that left me breathless. We stayed like that, our hands entwined, a silent connection that spoke louder than words. It was a fleeting moment, a stolen piece of time, but it felt like everything. A glimpse into a world where the rules didn't matter, where we could be exactly who we were without fear or judgment. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, he pulled away, his gaze dropping to the floor, a flicker of regret passing over his face. I should go, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I nodded, swallowing the disappointment that settled in my chest, the ache of a moment lost. Yeah, it's getting late. He stood, giving me a small, hesitant smile, as though he, too, felt the weight of what we had almost allowed to happen. And as I watched him walk away, I knew that things had shifted once again, that we had crossed another line, one that couldn't be erased. As I sat alone in the quiet living room, the memory of his touch lingering, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't fully understand: exhilaration, fear, desire. It was as though I was standing on the edge of something vast, something dangerous and thrilling, yet I couldn't bring myself to turn back. In the silence, I felt the weight of the choices I had yet to make, the lines we had yet to cross, and I knew that this was only the beginning of something I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. The days that followed were a test of patience, of restraint I hadn't known I possessed. Ryan and I tiptoed around each other, carefully avoiding moments alone, both of us wrapped in the lingering tension that had become almost unbearable. It was as though we were both holding our breath, afraid that any small movement might break the delicate balance we were struggling to maintain. But tonight was different. Ethan was away again, and with each empty room I passed, the emptiness inside me grew, a quiet reminder of all the spaces he had left unfilled. I knew Ryan was somewhere in the house, perhaps avoiding me as much as I was him, yet the knowledge of his presence was a comfort, a quiet pulse in the silence. I tried to busy myself with menial tasks, washing dishes that were already clean, straightening picture frames, adjusting the pillows on the couch, all the while feeling his presence, like a hum in the back of my mind. It was ridiculous, I told myself, childish even, but that didn't make it any easier to ignore. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, I wandered to the back of the house, toward the patio where the last hints of twilight cast a warm glow over the garden. And there he was, sitting on the edge of the deck, his face tilted up toward the sky, lost in thought. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding, wondering if it was wise to disturb him, if it was better to turn back before this fragile moment shattered. But something drew me forward, a quiet, unspoken need to be near him, to share the silence that felt somehow safer in his presence. He looked up as I approached, his gaze softening in a way that sent a shiver through me. Though he said nothing, I sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder, to catch the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the cool evening air. For a while we just sat there, letting the quiet settle over us, both of us lost in our own thoughts, in the weight of what we weren't saying. The sky darkened, the first stars appearing overhead, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in a long time, a calmness that felt both comforting and terrifying. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice barely more than a whisper. Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions? His words were soft, tentative, but they struck a chord deep within me, stirring emotions I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. All the time, I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. It's like life is happening around me, but I'm not really living it. I'm just there. He nodded, his gaze fixed on a distant point, his expression thoughtful. I guess I always thought things would be different, that there'd be more. I looked at him, the openness in his expression, the vulnerability in his eyes, and felt a wave of tenderness that left me breathless. I reached over, my hand resting lightly on his arm, a small gesture, but one that felt more intimate than words. I know what you mean, I murmured, my voice soft, almost a whisper. I think we all have moments like that, where we wonder if this is all there is, if this is enough. He looked down at my hand on his arm, his gaze lingering, his expression unreadable. Slowly, He turned his hand, his fingers brushing against mine, and the simple touch sent a thrill through me, a warmth that spread from my fingertips to my heart. For a moment, neither of us moved, both of us caught in the quiet, in the unspoken understanding that had woven itself between us. I could feel his breath, warm against my cheek, his presence a solid, grounding force that I wanted to hold on to keep close. And then, before I could process what was happening, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, a gentle, tentative kiss that left me breathless. It was soft, almost hesitant, as though he too was unsure, testing the boundaries we had both crossed in our hearts long before this moment. My heart pounded, my mind racing, but I couldn't pull away. I didn't want to. In that kiss, I felt everything I had been missing, everything I had yearned for in the quiet moments, the spaces where loneliness had crept in. I leaned into him, my hand moving to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my fingertips. His hands moved to my shoulders, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss, and I felt a rush of warmth, a spark that ignited something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. The world faded, the garden, the stars, everything else slipping away until it was just us, caught in a moment that felt both forbidden and perfect. I knew it was wrong, that there were boundaries we were crossing, lines we couldn't uncross. But in that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was the warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips, the way he held me as though I were something precious, something he was afraid to let go. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our gazes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between us. His hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing gently against my skin, and I felt a wave of emotions I couldn't name, a mix of exhilaration and fear, of joy and guilt. "Ryan," I began, my voice shaky, unsure of what I wanted to say, of what I could say in the wake of something that had shaken me to my core. He shook his head, his gaze softening, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You don't have to say anything. I couldn't keep pretending." The honesty in his words, the rawness of his emotions, made my heart ache in a way I couldn't explain. I wanted to say something, to tell him that I understood, that I felt the same way, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached up, my hand covering his, grounding myself in the warmth of his touch, in the quiet certainty that, for better or worse, something had shifted between us, something we couldn't ignore. We sat there, our hands entwined, a quiet understanding settling over us, both of us aware of the weight of our choices, the consequences we couldn't yet face. But for that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the warmth of his touch, the softness of his gaze, the quiet certainty that, whatever happened next, we were in this together. Eventually, the chill of the night air crept in, a gentle reminder of reality, of the world waiting just beyond this fragile moment. I pulled away, reluctantly, feeling the loss of his warmth, the ache of something unfinished, something that had only just begun. "We should go inside," I murmured, my voice barely audible, afraid to break the quiet understanding we had shared. He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine, and I saw the same reluctance mirrored in his eyes, the same quiet yearning that had drawn us together, that had woven itself into the spaces between us. We stood, moving back into the house in silence, each step a reminder of the boundary we had crossed, the line we had blurred, and as I closed the door behind us, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me, a quiet certainty that, whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The kiss lingered on my lips, a ghostly warmth that refused to fade, a reminder of everything we had shared, everything we couldn't take back. And as I lay in bed that night, staring into the darkness, I knew that I was standing on the edge of something vast, something dangerous and beautiful, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. The day after the kiss was filled with a tension that bordered on unbearable. I woke up feeling as if I were suspended between two worlds, the one I knew I belonged to and the one I had tasted the night before. I felt like an entirely different person, and yet everything around me was the same. The familiar creak of the floorboards as I padded down the hall, the morning sunlight filtering through the curtains, the sound of birds outside. But the memory of that kiss, the warmth of his hands on me, the feeling of being seen, understood it all clung to me, too close to forget and too powerful to ignore. I spent the morning trying to shake off the weight of my thoughts, doing my best to busy myself with chores, tasks, anything that might tether me to reality, but it was impossible. Every corner of the house seemed to carry an echo of him, a reminder of the night before, and I found myself holding my breath whenever I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, wondering if he felt the same pull. By mid-afternoon, the silence was too much. I decided to escape the house, hoping that a walk would clear my head. I threw on a jacket and stepped out into the brisk autumn air, letting the cool breeze wash over me, hoping it might temper the rush of emotions coursing through me. But as I made my way down the winding path that led through the trees behind our house, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart racing, and saw Ryan standing there, hands shoved into his pockets, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, almost tentative. I felt a rush of warmth spread through me, a mix of excitement and fear, and I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, what are you doing out here?" He shrugged, glancing away for a moment before meeting my gaze. "I saw you leave. I wanted to make sure you were okay." There was a gentleness in his words, a quiet understanding that cut through the tension and left me feeling exposed, vulnerable. I nodded, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to explain the storm of emotions swirling inside me. We walked together in silence, side by side, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the distant calls of birds. I could feel the weight of his presence, the warmth radiating from him, grounding me in a way that felt both comforting and dangerous, and yet I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Finally, we reached a small clearing, a quiet, secluded spot where the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. I stopped, turning to face him, the words I had been holding back pressing against me, demanding to be said. "Ryan." "About last night," I began, my voice trailing off as I searched his face for any sign of regret, of doubt. But he shook his head, a soft, rueful smile tugging at his lips. "I don't regret it, not a single second." His words hung in the air, wrapping around me, filling me with a sense of relief I hadn't realized I needed. I felt a rush of warmth, of gratitude, and I reached out, my fingers grazing his arm, a simple touch that felt anything but innocent. For a moment we just stood there, caught in the silence, in the weight of everything that had passed between us. His hand moved to cover mine, his fingers threading through mine, and I felt a shiver run through me, a thrill that left me breathless. Without thinking, without questioning, I closed the distance between us, my arms wrapping around him, pulling him close. His hands moved to my back, holding me with a tenderness that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. And as our lips met once more, I felt the last remnants of my restraint slip away, replaced by a warmth, a need that was impossible to deny. The world faded, the quiet forest, the sunlight, everything else slipping away until there was only us, caught in a moment that felt both forbidden and perfect. His hands moved over me, gentle, tentative, as though he were afraid I might vanish if he held on too tightly, and I held him just as fiercely, savoring the warmth of his touch, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. We spent what felt like hours there, wrapped in each other, lost in a moment that defied words, that transcended the boundaries of everything I had known. It was as though we had created our own world, a place where the rules didn't matter, where we could be exactly who we were without fear, without judgment. Eventually we pulled away, both of us breathless, our gazes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between us. His hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing gently against my skin, and I felt a wave of tenderness, of gratitude that left me feeling vulnerable, exposed. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, his eyes filled with a quiet vulnerability that mirrored my own. I swallowed, searching for the words, though I wasn't sure if I had any answers. I don't know. I just know that this feels right. Even if it's wrong, it feels. Like it was meant to happen, he finished, his gaze softening, a faint smile playing on his lips. I nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that, for better or worse, we were in this together. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen, understood in a way I hadn't been in years. And I knew that whatever came next, I would carry this moment with me, a quiet reminder of the life I had tasted, the love I had dared to reach for. We walked back in silence, our hands entwined, both of us caught in the quiet aftermath of what we had shared. I could feel the warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence grounding me, anchoring me in a way that left me feeling both exhilarated and terrified. As we neared the house, the reality of our situation began to settle over me, the weight of the choices we had made, the consequences we couldn't yet face. But I pushed the thoughts away, refusing to let the guilt, the fear creep in. For now, I wanted to hold on to this moment, to savor the quiet peace we had found, the love we had dared to claim. That evening, we shared a quiet dinner, our conversations filled with laughter, with stolen glances, a warmth that felt both new and achingly familiar. It was as though we were sharing a secret, a quiet understanding that bound us together in a way that defied explanation. And as the evening wore on, as the house grew quiet, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a certainty that, for better or worse, this was where I was meant to be. This was the love I had been searching for, the warmth I had been missing, and I knew that I couldn't let it go. We spent the night together, wrapped in each other's arms, sharing quiet whispers, stolen kisses, a love that felt as fragile as it was powerful. It was a night filled with warmth, with tenderness, a night that left me feeling whole, alive in a way I hadn't in years. And as I drifted off to sleep, my head resting on his chest, I felt a quiet sense of joy, a peace that filled every corner of my heart. For the first time in years, I felt complete, as though I had found the part of myself I had lost, the love I had dared to reach for. But as the dawn approached, as the first light of morning crept over the horizon, I knew that our moment was fleeting, that the reality of our choices was waiting just beyond the warmth of his embrace. The world outside was waiting, filled with consequences, with questions we couldn't yet answer. But for now, as I lay beside him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, I held on to the moment, to the love we had found, refusing to let it slip away. And as the morning light filled the room, casting a warm glow over everything, I knew that, for better or worse, I was where I was meant to be. The days that followed felt like a fever dream, filled with stolen moments and whispered secrets, a love that felt both fragile and powerful, existing only in the spaces we dared to carve out. Ryan and I moved through the house with a quiet rhythm, always aware of each other, finding ways to be alone, even if only for a few fleeting minutes. Each time we brushed hands in passing, each time our eyes met across the room, it was as though we were reaffirming something unspoken, a promise we had made to each other. But even in those moments, a sense of dread lingered beneath the surface, a quiet reminder that our world was a fragile one that could shatter with a single misstep. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, to push away the growing unease, I knew that our time was limited, that reality was waiting just beyond the warmth of our secret. Then, one evening, everything unraveled. Ethan returned home unexpectedly, his business trip cut short due to a canceled meeting. I hadn't been expecting him for another 3 days, and the sight of his car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of panic through me. Ryan and I had grown too comfortable, too bold in the time we'd had alone, and I hadn't prepared myself to face Ethan, hadn't braced myself for the return to reality. I composed myself as best as I could, smoothing my hair, straightening my clothes, trying to erase any sign of the turmoil that had been brewing beneath the surface. I met him at the door with a forced smile, hoping he wouldn't notice the tension, the nervous energy I couldn't quite shake. "Hey," he said, leaning in for a quick kiss on my cheek. "Thought I'd surprise you. Meetings got canceled, so I figured I'd come back early." "That's wonderful," I replied, my voice barely steady, forcing a smile as I stepped back to let him inside. He looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly, as though sensing something was off, but he didn't press. Instead, he set his bags down, letting out a sigh as he stretched, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil churning inside me. "Where's Ryan?" he asked, glancing around. I wanted to catch up with him, see how he's doing. The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to think of an answer, feeling my heart race. "He's out, I think. He said he'd be back later." Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response, and moved toward the living room, settling onto the couch with a sigh of contentment. "It's good to be home," he murmured, leaning back, closing his eyes. I watched him, a knot of guilt forming in my chest, the weight of everything I had been hiding pressing down on me, suffocating in its intensity. I wanted to tell him, to confess, to explain the emptiness that had driven me to this, the loneliness that had led me down a path I never could have imagined. But the words wouldn't come, trapped beneath the fear of what might happen, of the life we might lose. Hours passed with me moving around the house in a haze, trying to avoid Ethan, to avoid Ryan. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the weight of my choices suffocating, filling every corner of the house with a tension I could no longer ignore. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, Ethan walked into the kitchen, glancing around, his expression curious. "Have you seen my phone charger?" he asked, rummaging through a drawer. "I swear I left it in here before I left." I shook my head, my hands shaking slightly as I chopped vegetables, focusing on the repetitive motion, hoping it might steady me. "No, I haven't seen it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I probably left it in the bedroom. I'll go check." My heart skipped a beat, a sense of dread settling over me as I watched him leave the kitchen, heading toward the bedroom. I knew that Ryan had been there earlier, had left his things scattered in a way that felt both familiar and dangerous. Panic clawed at me as I abandoned the chopping board, my feet moving before I could stop myself, following him down the hall, hoping I could catch him before he saw anything, before he realized. But it was too late. I reached the doorway just as he picked up a book from the bedside table, his eyes narrowing as he examined the dog-eared pages, the familiar handwriting scrawled in the margins Ryan's handwriting. He looked up, his gaze sharp, questioning, and I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding as I struggled to find an explanation. "What's this?" he asked, his tone measured. But I could hear the edge of suspicion, the undercurrent of something darker, something dangerous. I opened my mouth, searching for words, but none came. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Every secret I had been hiding laid bare beneath his gaze. I wanted to lie, to fabricate an explanation, but the truth was written in his eyes, a truth that could no longer be denied. He looked down at the book again, his expression hardening, and I saw the realization dawn, the pieces falling into place with a quiet, devastating certainty. He knew. He didn't have to ask, didn't need to confront me. The silence said everything, a silence that hung heavy in the air, filling the room with a weight I couldn't escape. I watched as his face twisted, a mixture of disbelief and hurt contorting his features, and I felt a pang of guilt, a sharp, stabbing pain that cut through me, leaving me breathless. "Is this?" His voice trailed off, barely a whisper, as though he couldn't bring himself to say the words, as though saying them would make it real. I took a step back, my hands trembling, my heart pounding as I struggled to find my voice, to explain, to justify. But there was no explanation, no justification that could make this right. "It's not," I began, my voice cracking, but the words felt hollow, empty, a feeble attempt to hide a truth that could no longer be denied. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain I hadn't seen before, a betrayal that left me feeling small, insignificant. And in that moment, I knew that there was no going back, no way to repair the damage I had done, the hurt I had caused. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible, filled with a sorrow that left me feeling hollow. I swallowed, the words caught in my throat, my mind racing, searching for an answer, for something that might make him understand. But there was nothing, no explanation that could ease the pain, no words that could make this right. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips, a sound filled with a bitterness I had never heard before. "You don't know?" His voice was a mixture of disbelief and anger, a raw, visceral pain that cut through me. I felt the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, the weight of my choices pressing down on me, the realization of everything I had lost settling over me like a shroud. And then, without another word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall, each step a reminder of the life I had shattered, the love I had betrayed. I stood there, alone in the silence, feeling the weight of my choices, the devastation of what I had lost. The house felt empty, hollow, every corner filled with the echoes of a love that had once been, a love that I had taken for granted, a love I had destroyed. And as the silence settled over me, I knew that I was standing on the edge of something vast, something irrevocable. I had crossed a line I could never return from, and the consequences of my choices loomed before me, vast and unyielding. I sank to the floor, my hands trembling, the tears streaming down my face as I realized the full weight of what I had done, the quiet devastation that had become my reality. In that moment, I knew that nothing would ever be the same, that the life I had once known was gone, replaced by a reality I could no longer escape. The following day, the air in the house was thick, charged with the weight of everything that had been left unspoken. Ethan moved around in silence, his presence a constant reminder of the fragility of the life I'd built, and how quickly it could all come crashing down. I went through the motions of daily life, desperately clinging to the routine, hoping that somehow things might return to normal, even as I knew deep down that normal was slipping further away with every passing moment. As evening fell, Ethan lingered in the kitchen, gathering his things for yet another business dinner. He looked at me for a moment, a strange glint in his eyes, as though he were searching for something. Though he said nothing, just as I thought he was about to leave, he paused in the doorway, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll be home late," he said, his voice low and measured. "Don't wait up." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, hoping my face betrayed nothing, though the unspoken tension hung heavily between us. He left, his footsteps echoing through the silence, and I stood there, my heart pounding, the sense of dread growing with each minute that ticked by. Something in his tone, in the lingering glance, made me uneasy, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was nothing, that he couldn't possibly know. Hours passed, and I drifted through the house, trying to busy myself, to escape the ache that had settled in my chest. Ryan was out as well, and the house felt emptier than it had in years, filled only with the echoes of my thoughts, the memories that refused to fade. I glanced at the clock, hoping for a distraction, but the silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. And then, just as the clock struck 10, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Panic surged through me, sharp and unexpected. Ethan hadn't mentioned coming home early, and I knew instinctively that this was no ordinary return. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart racing, my mind scrambling for answers, for some way to explain the fear that tightened in my chest. The front door opened, and I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, each step punctuating the silence like a hammer blow. I swallowed, forcing myself to move, to face him, even as every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide from the inevitable confrontation. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw him standing there, his face set, his expression unreadable. But there was a darkness in his eyes, a quiet fury that sent a chill through me, and I knew in that moment that he had discovered the truth, that the fragile facade I'd built had finally shattered. "You think I'm a fool." His voice was calm, too calm, a controlled fury simmering beneath the surface. I opened my mouth, searching for words, for an explanation. But nothing came. I felt the color drain from my face, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, and I knew there was no escape, no way to deny the truth that lay bare between us. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine, and I saw the pain, the betrayal etched into his features, a raw wound that cut deeper than any words could convey. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" he continued, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a quiet bitterness. "That I wouldn't notice you slipping away, hiding parts of yourself that used to be mine?" I took a step back, my hands trembling, my heart pounding, but he followed, his gaze hardening, and I knew there was no escaping this moment, no way to avoid the reckoning that had finally arrived. It wasn't supposed to be like this," I stammered, my voice barely audible, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating. He let out a bitter laugh, a sound filled with disbelief, with hurt, and I felt the sharp sting of regret, the realization of everything I had destroyed settling over me like a shroud. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he repeated, his voice laced with anger, with a pain that cut through me, leaving me breathless. What was it supposed to be then? Some sling, a thrill you could just walk away from. I shook my head, the words caught in my throat, tangled and heavy, unable to convey the tangled mess of emotions that had led me down this path. "It wasn't like that," I whispered, my voice breaking, though I knew the words were hollow, meaningless in the face of his betrayal. He looked at me, his gaze filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow, and I saw the depth of his pain, the hurt that I had inflicted, and it left me feeling small, insignificant. "You know," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I trusted you. I thought we had something real. And now I don't know if I even know who you are." The words hit me like a blow, sharp and unforgiving, and I felt the tears welling up, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating. I wanted to reach out, to touch him, to tell him that I was still the same person, that I hadn't meant to hurt him, but I knew it was too late, that the damage had already been done. He looked away, his shoulders slumping, a quiet, defeated sigh escaping his lips. "I don't even know why I'm here," he muttered, more to himself than to me, his voice filled with a bitterness that left me feeling hollow. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and I felt the weight of his pain, of his betrayal settling over us, filling the room with an ache that I couldn't escape. I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely more than a breath, though I knew they would never be enough, that no apology could ever erase the hurt I had caused. He looked at me, his gaze hardening, and I saw the anger flicker to life once more, a quiet fury that sent a chill through me. "Sorry," he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "You think sorry makes this right? That it somehow undoes everything you've done?" I shook my head, my hands trembling, my heart pounding, but I knew there was no answer, no explanation that could make any of this right. He took a step back, his gaze lingering on me for a moment, a mixture of anger and sadness in his eyes. I think I need some time to figure out what's left, if there's anything left." The words hit me with a quiet finality, a sense of dread settling over me as I realized the full weight of what he was saying, the cold, harsh truth that our life together was slipping away, piece by piece. He turned, his footsteps echoing down the hall, each step a reminder of the life I had shattered, the love I had taken for granted. I watched him go, my heart breaking, the tears streaming down my face as I realized the full extent of my betrayal, the quiet devastation that had become my reality. In that moment, I knew that there was no going back, no way to repair the damage I had done. I was left with the silence, the emptiness of a life forever changed, a love I had thrown away in a single, selfish act. And as the door closed behind him, the finality of it settling over me, I sank to the floor, my hands trembling, my heart breaking, the weight of my choices pressing down on me, leaving me with nothing but regret, with the quiet, hollow ache of a life that could never be the same. The house felt like a graveyard in the days that followed. Ethan hadn't said another word to me since that moment in the bedroom. He moved around like a ghost, his face blank, his eyes hollow, and the distance between us grew with each passing hour. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, filled with every word left unsaid, every betrayal, every shattered promise. Ryan had left, too. After the confrontation, he disappeared without so much as a goodbye, taking only a small bag and leaving everything else behind. I could still see traces of him around the house. An open book on the coffee table, a jacket draped over the back of a chair, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Each reminder felt like a wound, raw and open, a quiet reminder of everything I had lost, everything I had destroyed. I went through the days in a fog, barely able to focus, haunted by the choices I had made, the life I had let slip through my fingers. It was as though I were floating, detached from reality, caught in a limbo where time had no meaning, where each day bled into the next, filled with an emptiness I couldn't escape. Ethan remained silent, his presence a constant reminder of my guilt, of the betrayal that hung between us like a shadow. He didn't confront me, didn't ask for an explanation, and somehow that hurt even more. The quietness of his pain was worse than any argument, any fight. It was a quiet, simmering agony that filled every room, every moment, until I could barely breathe. One night, after yet another silent dinner, I finally found the courage to speak, to break the silence that had settled over us like a shroud. Ethan, I began, my voice trembling, barely more than a whisper. I need to explain. He looked at me, his eyes empty, his face unreadable, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't respond. But then he sighed, a sound filled with exhaustion, with resignation. "Go ahead," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking, and forced myself to continue. "I don't know where to begin. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." He looked at me, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Never wanted to hurt me." His voice was quiet, but the pain was unmistakable. "You think that makes it any better?" I felt a pang of guilt, a hollow ache that settled in my chest. But I pressed on, knowing that I owed him the truth, even if it was painful, even if it was something he didn't want to hear. I felt alone. For so long. And I know that doesn't justify anything, but I need you to understand I was lost. And Ryan, he was just there. He was there when I felt like I had no one. He shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "You think I wasn't there for you? That I didn't try? I worked to build a life for us, to give you everything you wanted. And this is what I get in return." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat, tangled and heavy, unable to express the tangled mess of emotions inside me. I had no answers, no justification that could ease his pain, that could make any of this right. Ethan looked away, his hands clenched, his jaw tight. "I loved you. I trusted you. And you threw it all away. For what? A moment? A thrill?" I felt the tears welling up, the weight of his words cutting through me like a knife. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." He didn't respond, didn't look at me, his silence more painful than any words he could have spoken. I felt the tears streaming down my face, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice filled with a quiet finality. "I think we need time apart." The words hit me like a punch, knocking the breath from my lungs. "Ethan, please, I can't." He held up a hand, his gaze hardening, and I knew there was no room for argument, no room for pleas. "I need time. Time to figure out what's left of us. If there's anything left to save." The reality of his words settled over me, a cold, harsh truth that I couldn't escape. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, knowing that I had no choice, that I had made my bed and now I had to lie in it. In the days that followed, Ethan began the process of moving out. He packed his things in silence, his expression blank, his movements mechanical. I watched him go, feeling as though a part of me were being ripped away, yet knowing I had no right to stop him, no right to beg him to stay. And then, one day, he was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that filled every corner of the house, a silence that was deafening in its finality. I was alone. Days turned into weeks, and the loneliness became a constant companion, a quiet ache that filled every moment. I wandered through the house, surrounded by the ghosts of a life I had destroyed, haunted by the choices I had made, by the love I had lost. I tried to fill the emptiness with routine, with distractions, but nothing could ease the hollow ache in my chest, the sense of loss that lingered, refusing to fade. I didn't hear from Ryan. Part of me had hoped he might reach out, that we could find some closure, some way to make sense of everything that had happened. But he remained silent, leaving me with nothing but memories, with the haunting echoes of a love that had been as fleeting as it was devastating. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in shadows, I found myself sitting in the empty living room, the silence pressing down on me, suffocating. I closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me, the laughter, the stolen moments, the warmth of his touch. And for the first time, I allowed myself to mourn, to feel the full weight of everything I had lost. The tears came slowly at first, a quiet release, but soon they were flowing freely, a torrent of grief and regret that I had kept bottled up for too long. I sobbed into the emptiness, letting the pain, the guilt, the sorrow wash over me, cleansing in its agony. When the tears finally stopped, I was left with a sense of emptiness, a hollow peace that settled over me. I knew that I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices I had made, but I could choose what came next. I would rebuild, piece by piece, finding a way to live with the pain, to move forward, to find meaning in the life I had left. It would be a long road, filled with sorrow and regret, but I knew that I could endure, that I could find a way to make peace with the choices I had made, with the love I had lost. And as I sat there, bathed in the quiet, in the stillness of a life forever changed, I felt a glimmer of hope, a faint, fragile light that told me that one day I might find a way to heal, to forgive myself, to start anew. But for now, I would sit with the silence, with the memories, allowing the pain to settle, knowing that this was the beginning of something new, a journey of healing, of redemption, of learning to live with the scars I had created. I would carry this with me, a quiet reminder of the life I had lost, the love I had dared to claim, and the price I had paid. And maybe one day I would find peace.